Welcome back to Selling the Ages. My name is Weston. I am the host, and I'm joined by Lisa Shorts, the co-host. And we are very excited today to be talking about one of our favorite periods of history, the Tudor period. And today we're going to be really discussing how Henry VIII cut ties with Rome and rebranded the faith in England. So this is going to be a fun one. Ever since I was young, I have been enthralled by the Tudor period. I absolutely love it. Something about Henry VIII and his 7 wives.
It was a soap opera.
It was an absolute soap opera. And it's just so interesting. Having been there a couple times and actually seeing the foundation and the area where Anne Boleyn was executed. I mean, it just really spoke to me. That whole entire period is just so interesting.
That's a great marketing story. They took someone that was a loyal wife and turned her into every bad thing a woman could be at the time to basically railroad her. But we'll get to why in the context that we talk about, because there were many, many, many reasons that happened. But it was a smear campaign.
It was. It absolutely was. And, the angle in which I wanted to go with this episode is highlighting the specific break from Rome. And I feel like when a lot of people talk about Henry VIII, it's really focused in on his 7 wives and the entire, storyline. 6 wives, my apologies. And he, a lot of the stories focus on that piece of his life.
Yeah, it's like it's the only thing he ever did.
Right. And there was so much more to his time as being king. And I think that there's a lot more that we can talk about. So I wanted to focus in on specifically his break with the Catholic Church. So I'd love to kind of hear from you, maybe provide some historical context onto why and what happened.
Okay. So for context, Henry was the second son of Elizabeth and Henry VII, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII. And that soap opera, the War of the Roses soap opera, ended with Henry and Elizabeth basically joining those 2 houses. So even though there was a lot of intrigue in their lives while they were establishing the solidity of that line, the Lancastrian line, there were still controversies for a while when Henry was growing up that were related to that long conflict.
And fun fact, that's what Game of Thrones is based off of.
Because it could be, because there's that much intrigue. It was, several houses trying to get control of the monarchy. There's the whole Richard III thing and the controversy about the boys in the tower. And there's so much meat on that bone. We could talk about just that for hours.
Separate episode for that one.
Exactly. But by the time Henry was a young man, his father had died, and his brother becomes king. But his brother dies very young. They think of an interesting form of strep, but that's just an interesting little tidbit. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, to unite the countries. But according to Catherine, they'd never consummated the marriage. They were very young, 14 years old. So when Arthur, the older brother, died very young, Henry was suddenly cast into the role of king, and he had not been prepared for being king because you didn't do that with second sons. Mm-hmm. But there he was now, very, very young, the king of a country, and he has this young companion that had been brought over for his brother who was kind of untethered. Interesting position to be in as a Spanish princess, because if you've been married to a royal, the church is like, nope, you're a dowager. Mm-hmm. You can't do anything else. But she didn't even have children yet. She was maybe 15, I think. So a lot of the shows, like Wolf Hall and all of those other shows, The Spanish Princess, they depict this budding romance between the two of them. I haven't read up on the sources for whether or not that's really sustainable, that idea, but they had become friends. And in 1509, they get married. Henry didn't petition Rome for the divorce for 18 years.
From my understanding, he was in love with her.
Yeah, they had a very solid relationship.
Yeah.
They were partners. They acted as partners. The other thing, it seems like a lot of people don't know, is that she had 8 pregnancies during their marriage, and only one child made it to adulthood. She did have boy babies, but they died shortly after birth. If you look back, you know how they do medical autopsies of old, they go through old records and they say, well, with all these symptoms, we think that it was this. Well, he must have had some issue with, I don't know if it's the Rh factor or whatever, but even Anne Boleyn, his second wife, had only one child that grew to adulthood, and then her subsequent children, she miscarried. So there's something medical there that probably they could put their finger on. But anyway, point is, Henry was desperate for an heir. In the beginning, probably wasn't a big deal because Catherine kept getting pregnant, and so the trying was working. But then he started to get really neurotic about not being able to have an heir. And Catherine was, let's see, she'd have been late 30s, early 40s when Henry decides, I need someone else to give me an heir. And in the meantime, he has met Anne Boleyn, who is part of Catherine's household, and fallen in love with her. And she was pretty clever about how she handled the relationship. She didn't, immediately get interested in him. She was actually betrothed to someone else, but obviously that went by the wayside. Henry does all of these machinations to get away from Rome because Rome won't give him a divorce. It didn't help that Catherine was related to the Holy Roman the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Catholic Church is not want to dissolve a marriage that put two countries together, but also was a huge political issue in the Catholic ecosystem or Catholic universe. So Cardinal Wolsey, who was Henry's advisor, counselor, he was a very high-ranking official in Henry's court. He tried to do his best to get the church to dissolve the marriage, and they used every tactic possible. That Catherine had consummated the marriage with Arthur, and therefore the marriage to Henry was cursed and also illicit. So they weren't just actually trying to get a divorce; they were trying to get an annulment.
Yeah, they used biblical terms that saying, a wife could not marry
her brother's
or
her husband's brother, right? That kind of thing. So there were all these rules set up, and then adding royal rules on top of it made it more complicated. But Henry was hyper-focused on having an heir. And everything that he did to break with Rome was a smear campaign so that Rome would say, okay, well, this is bad. We will grant you the annulment.
I think also at that time, there was a growing sentiment amongst Protestants that it was starting to spread.
Right, yeah.
And Anne Boleyn was a Protestant.
She was. So that is an interesting point that's going to show up again later in this conversation, because the Protestant movement that started with Martin Luther was just a movement at the time. Henry was a staunch Catholic. He even wrote a treatise defending the Catholic, or I don't want to say organization, but the sacraments and the way that Catholicism was practiced. So when Protestantism started to take hold, it still hadn't pushed him to move away from the church. This annulment thing was the thing.
It was the catalyst.
Right. And then in the meantime, Wolsey had hired a, I don't know what you call Cromwell in the early days, attaché, advisor, whatever.
Very savvy legal advisor.
Very savvy legal advisor. Cromwell was the mechanic behind everything that happened after the annulment.
Mm-hmm.
But Henry's break was him basically saying, okay, fine. You won't give me a divorce. You won't give me an annulment. I am now the head of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And he pulls England away from the Catholic Church. And that sounds like such a simple concept because religions break apart all the time. Still to this day, we have, just in the U.S. alone, I think there are 2,500 different Protestant sects of Christianity. So you have all kinds of people competing for their own dogma. And, the one thing that is true, the only one thing that is true about every single religion, all of them, doesn't matter which one you pick, from which part of the world, it will eventually eat its own tenets and become something else. And that was essentially what was happening here, because Henry didn't de-Catholicize the church when he took it, when he became the supreme head of the church. It was essentially Catholic light. Yeah. And that's what the Episcopals call it. That is basically what he implemented.
Yeah.
So it wasn't, do all these things, remove all these things, change all these things. It was, I am now head of the church in England, and Rome does not get to make our decisions anymore.
It was rooted in ego and his desire to literally be with a woman.
But at that point, it was neuroses. He really, really, really was obsessed with having a male heir.
So hyper-focused on it. And I think it's also interesting that I was watching a documentary some time ago talking about how Anne Boleyn gave him the book of, I can't think of the name of the book, but it's the baseline Protestant book where it talks about how in Protestantism, you are the head of the church as the king. And that really spoke to him and his ego. And he said, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it really, a combination of that plus this beguiling woman and the idea of, him being able to father a son, it was the perfect storm.
Yeah. And he bought into all of it, hook, line, and sinker. And then Cromwell was like, yes, let's go do it. And one of the funniest things about this research to me, because I had not researched this part of it until you and I started talking, is that he was not the instrument of the rebranding. Cromwell was. And Cromwell went at it really hard. So by the time 1536 rolls around, you have what everyone knows as the dissolution of the monasteries. And if you go anywhere in the UK and you look at any of the churches that are left half standing, everybody assumes that it was, a huge violent fire breaking down all of the monasteries. It didn't really happen that way. In fact, an important thing to note is that speaking to Henry's ability to handle the corporation that was his court and his country, and then the surrounding lands, even his, foray into having part of France, all of those things were corporate management. And I'm using the word corporate as managing a body of things. Mm-hmm. So all of the management of the land ownership would fall into this corporate management. Well, there were places around the country where they had monasteries or abbeys or even convents that the community, for example, would die off from plague. Mm-hmm. And then there was no one to serve in the community. So the monasteries, some of them would die on the vine. So that was a constant thing. It's not like in 1536, all of a sudden, all the monasteries were wiped out. It didn't happen that way. And it had gone on for, since the invention of the monastery. They lived and died by their ability to thrive in a particular community. There's no one to make beer for. Yeah. They don't need to make the beer. So it is kind of a myth. And there was one article that I was reading that actually called it the myth of the dissolution. The biggest ones were the biggest money makers. So if you had a community that was, it had this big cathedral and the monastery had 150 members and they had been collecting wealth, then that was a target for Cromwell for a couple of reasons. One, the wealth of the papacy just reinforced this idea that the papacy had too much control. So they wanted to take back that wealth for the king.
I think it was also an instrument for Cromwell to become and have more power in Henry's court, because he's
absolutely.
Like, look, Henry, look how much I've been able to, make for you. And
he built
filling your coffers.
Absolutely. And all of the land that belonged to all those monasteries went back to the king, who could then sell the land for profit.
Yeah.
So there was a huge economic driving factor in that. But that's not how you sell it to the public. You sell it to the public by vilifying the papacy for all of the oppressive things that they do. Didn't talk about all the little things they did, like, feed the poor, but that wealth was a big deal. So it's one of those things where he's marketing the idea as, well, I am your sovereign, so I should be the head of the church. I am your sovereign. I need a male heir. Anne is, the new queen, and she has the Protestant side, which, influencing Henry away from what he had been living.
Although he still was a pretty staunch Catholic.
He was. Even until Elizabeth became queen, the Catholic light didn't really leave. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the big contentions between her and her sister. Her sister thought she should be practicing Catholicism in a particular way, but she was more Protestant. So all of this rebranding, all of this, you need to see the church in a different way. You need to see the king as head of the church. There were a lot of people who fought it for the blasphemy of it, but there were a lot of guys who capitalized on it. So there's also, what I found interesting in the notes was these people kind of picked up the torch to more Protestantize the country than the king had really leaned on. Right. And that's how you get Puritans, and those are the ones that came here. And this is another fallacy that I recently read something about. It had to do with George III, but the idea that the Puritans came here because they were being persecuted is completely false. Mm-hmm. They came here because they were religious extremists, and they were not able to practice their extremism in the confines of what became the Anglican Church. Mm-hmm. Their brand was no ostentatious anything. The artwork on the walls in the church was like, nope, we're going to completely redesign the way our churches are. Nothing on the walls but a cross. The pews were very simple. Everything was downgraded to a very simple idea that the only thing we should be looking up at is the cross.
Right.
Now, imagine you're in a Catholic church and you look at all of the artwork on the walls and all of the gold and all of the silver. It is a completely different animal than what the Puritans were after. Maximalist. The more we do for God, the better it will be. St. Paul's is a good representation of what happened with how they wanted to change the iconography, but they couldn't get away from the fact that they wanted to make this beautiful edifice that was an Anglican edifice. If you look up in the cupola in St. Paul's in London, there is a painted cycle, which they used to do in the churches because people couldn't read. So their New Testament reading was through these panels. So that cycle is painted monochrome because they wanted to paint a story cycle, but they did not want to give it the grandiosity of how the Catholic Church would have painted it. So that's that balance between, we don't want to be attached to Rome, but, we still want to worship in the big way that we used to worship.
I think, when we talk about the rebranding of England and the faith of England, it's easy to, at this point, talk about it in a large scale. But I do think that it's important to recognize how many lives were affected and lost through this process, because it wasn't only Henry and the official breaking from Rome, but then kind of bounced back and forth after Mary took over, went back to Catholicism, and then Elizabeth took over.
Reason they call her Bloody Mary.
Exactly. So it was definitely a roller coaster of forcing their people to make all of these adjustments. And so it really was a very turbulent time.
And it was economically turbulent too. People, I think, don't, unless you live in that space and you can visually see the evolution of it, you don't realize how much it changed the economy of certain places. If you pull the monastery out and the monastery is feeding the poor people in that area, what happens to the poor people in that area? How about the monks and nuns that were living in those cloisters? And after their home was basically taken away, because there were cases where you had a whole convent full of nuns who were like, now what? Well, a lot of them were nuns because they were second and third daughters. And it got, in that period of time, it got so expensive to give a dowry when a young woman was married that they would only marry off their first daughters. And the spares would either become governesses or they would become the aunt that took care of the children, or they'd go into a convent. Now, all of a sudden, you have 20 women who'd been living in a convent who have nowhere to go. They'd go back to their families, but now they're a burden on their families, according to the families, because they hadn't planned to feed another adult. So it's not like
firstborns.
Exactly. It's not like they could go, start a new career.
Yeah.
It displaced a lot of people, and it also displaced a lot of ideas that had been the biggest idea that it displaced. And I can't believe I didn't mention this first, is it was the idea that you don't need a Latin priest, a Latin reading or speaking priest to tell you what to think about God, because you can read it for yourself. So one of the major shifts that happened was education became a whole new concept. And that was another reason that some of the monasteries and convents had been converted, because they didn't necessarily close them, but they converted them to an educational system and then changed the way that education worked so that people would learn to read in English.
Yeah.
They produced English Bibles, and then you could go read about God for yourself.
I honestly really do agree with that. That piece of it is where you're allowing your public, and you don't want necessarily the public to become too knowledgeable, but at the same time, they should have access to their own faith.
They should. And if you're going to teach people to read a language, you also need to teach them that interpretation is really subjective.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're talking about dead languages. So if you have somebody that's interpreting ancient Greek, which is no longer spoken, hasn't been for hundreds of years, then their interpretation of a single word might be different than the person sitting next to them.
Yeah.
So teaching people to read Latin and Greek meant they were reading the native language. When you decided to make an English Bible, that had to be translated by somebody.
And who's responsible for that translation?
Exactly. Well, then you get into the King James translation, that's later on. But one of the rules that Henry set up was, in any church in his new sphere, there had to be an English Bible, and it had to be displayed. And then you had people reading the material themselves and thinking for themselves, and it changed the way that they looked at education for children.
It's really interesting. I definitely feel like taking a look at the way that it was rebranded. I mean, there's so much overlay, and we're really looking at this from a very high scope here. But taking into consideration some modern aspects of rebranding, right? I think there are successful ways to do it, and there's successful ways that you can absolutely fail at those endeavors.
We've seen that a lot recently.
Yeah, we have. We have. I actually wanted to kind of take a second to think about some of those successful rebrands and some that really haven't hit the mark. And I'll just kind of run through a couple examples. And I'd love to kind of tie at the end, how does that, was Henry's intention to rebrand the nation and the faith of a nation based off of his personal ego? Like, kind of bring it back around to what were the ulterior motives there, which I think we did cover a bit. But some of the examples of the rebrands that I've pulled out for us to talk about today are recent and kind of polarizing. So one of them being the recent Jaguar rebrand. That's a big one. I'm not sure if you watched their marketing video. Did you see that anywhere?
I didn't. I was hearing about it from several sources, though. There was a lot of conversation about it.
Yes, it was very controversial. I actually was really looking forward to the launch. When I watched the video, I was pretty shocked. It was completely different than any of their brand values. It was ultra modern. And when you're saying ultra modern, I mean, it was leaning so far into the artistic realm that it felt like there was absolutely no root in their original brand whatsoever. And I think that truly the people who were responsible for those campaigns wanted it to be that way. They wanted it to be an entirely new shift from their old brand. But at the end of the day, it came with what it was. Everybody knows it as this very particular style.
Prestigious,
rooted in luxury, and it just took such a shift in the wrong direction, really, that it actually significantly impacted their economy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 97%, I think I have here, just so I can speak correctly on it, 97.5 year-over-year decline. They sold 49 units in Europe in 1 year.
That's unheard of.
It's horrific, actually. And I think it was so out of touch with their entire brand. They rooted it in wanting to become this kind of ultra modern, just new age type of brand, and it was a complete flop. And I think kind of looking at reasons as to why that happened, it's because they didn't root it in anything that they believed in.
Their history.
Everything that they've built, they abandoned. They misread the timing of it. I feel like they were kind of coming into it saying, oh, well, we're going to be this like new age. We're tapping into the younger markets and taking advantage of like the new money markets, where it really kind of didn't hit that at all.
The younger markets don't have the new money. Not yet.
The people of the term old money and new money. And so the new money comes from these younger, maybe millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that have made their claim to fame on social media platforms. And they do come into a significant amount of money. And, what cars are you going to be purchasing at that point? And I feel like they were trying to reach into that new arena, and it was just so unsuccessful. They really just did it with so much disregard to who they were and where they came from, that I felt like it didn't resonate. And
did they do any market testing?
I honestly don't know, because when they released it, it was so shocking to so many people that I felt like there wasn't even any really advertising beforehand to kind of signify that they're going to have such a significant shift. So
they didn't drum up any interest in it first.
And when they launched, it was really shocking. People were very upset by it. And I think that the numbers prove it. So when
they often do.
Absolutely. And
money talks.
I kind of think back to the rebranding, and in the historical sense, Protestantism was already kind of popping up in these small circles.
And Europe was handling it much different.
Yeah.
Much differently than England did.
Absolutely. And I think that there were pockets already existed. It was able to
Oh,
reach
sure.
the king. So you know that there was some relevance that if this were to have happened, just like Cromwell knew, it wasn't going to, that you weren't going to get a civilian revolt. You weren't going to,
If you did it right.
if you did it right. And he was successful at that. So I just think it's interesting, kind of always tying back to like the core of our podcast and selling the ages and why it worked. Cromwell was a master at making that happen, where I look at like a Jaguar and it just was very unsuccessful.
Cromwell seemed to have known his audience.
Absolutely.
And, there's plenty of evidence that he abused the power, because as he took land back from monasteries, and not just monasteries, but people who opposed the king's, any of the king's new stuff, anybody who opposed that would get into a whole bunch of trouble for treason.
Mm-hmm.
So he found the perfect vehicle to really push away anybody who was going to disagree with any of the new rules he was setting up. And he had carte blanche for a while until he screwed up.
Yep. And then also Anne Boleyn became one of his nemesis, essentially.
Right.
So it's also a very
and his victim.
shift. Yes. And his victim.
He got his in the end, though.
Yes, he did. It's interesting. So we see a really unsuccessful style, and kind of looking at in my opinion, one of the most successful. I think I wanted to zero in on the CVS success.
Mm-hmm.
When CVS, had first started, and where they were getting most of their success back in, I believe, the 40s, was when they were a convenience store,
mm-hmm.
and they were selling, tobacco. I think that was one of their largest revenue making and
kind of funny that they ended up in pharmaceuticals.
Exactly. And so it is super interesting that it's now $100 billion, healthcare powerhouse. It really is. And you look at things like them having to rebrand it completely, recognizing that their audience wanted that health angle. They
Right.
wanted to become a healthy organization. And so what did they have to do? They have to cut out the tobacco. It was very forward thinking. I thought that was really interesting. And it ended up that they cut $2 billion of revenue in specifically just the tobacco.
Wow, that's huge.
Significant impact in their business. And it was a giant risk for them to do that. But they said, we want to be the health brand. We want to have our audience look at us in a completely different light, because you can't have tobacco and you can't have, claim that you are a health organization, one and the same. And that was eventually...
Well, you could in the 70s.
You could. And when they realized, hey, maybe we shouldn't be prescribing people tobacco to calm down. But essentially, they position themselves as one of the largest healthcare brands, and they still are. You think of where can you go get quick flu shots? That is one of them. They're a massive pharmaceutical brand. So such a huge risk that paid off in such a significant way. And, they have so much market share, and they'll be able to stay alive for the next coming generation because of that massive risk.
I wasn't aware of that one. I didn't realize that they had taken that big a risk.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you still cannot buy tobacco there. Yep, you can't buy vapes, anything like that.
That would be a good plan for a pharmaceutical company, for sure.
Yeah, so that is definitely an example of a win. And some other ones that I think you probably are super familiar with, like Meta, going from Facebook to Meta, this metaverse, and where they're trying to go. I think when they originally did it, it wasn't very successful because people were very confused by it.
They didn't know what it meant.
The functionality of it all.
Yeah.
And then eventually now I think that they've really turned the corner on it becoming a more successful move since the very beginning of that split in 2021.
Yeah, they're treating it more like an add-on or a function rather than an entire rebrand. And I really do think people struggled with what that rebrand looks like. They kept talking about Meta coming. Meta is coming.
Yeah.
But they didn't explain to the hundreds of millions of users what that meant, and 50% of those people don't understand technology at all. That, I think that was, it was very frustrating for people in the IT world too.
Yeah. And same thing in the marketing realm too, because we use Meta for in the marketing sense and being able to connect profiles and utilize the ad software. And it was a big shift. It was very different than how we were doing it before. So at the end of the day, it ended up being successful. I think so. They had a 22% year over year increase from last year. And I think it goes to show that the changes that they're making are long-term changes. They're really thinking about what the advertising and the marketing world is going to look like in more than 5-10 years from now, which is why they're creating this metaverse and being able to use the business assets that you can create within the platform is a lot more advanced than what it used to be.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Just the ads alone. Funny, I read an article about this when your cousin was little, that about the Montessori Mafia.
That's interesting.
And the reason it's relevant to what we're talking about is they're the group of people that had the biggest success on the internet: Facebook, Words with Friends, Amazon. There's one other that I can't remember right off the top of my head, but they were all Montessori kids. And the one thing that they said it taught them was it's okay to make the mistake, because that's how you learn. You back up, regroup, and try something new. So they said their foray into college business did not teach them that. They learned that lesson very, very young in Montessori training, to be okay with having made a design mistake, or, like wrote your letter backwards, because the next time you do it, you have the opportunity to make it better. And that seems like exactly what Meta was.
I think so. At the Montessori Mafia, that's
It's
hilarious.
a great article.
I think that specifically speaks to Cracker Barrel.
Yeah.
What we all just witnessed. Was it a marketing ploy? Was it not? I don't know.
Could be.
But it was successful at the end of the day when they were able to say, hey, you know what? We hear you. We're not going to get rid of our timeless logo. We're not going to get rid of the rocking chairs. And we will make sure to keep your, market that you go to inside of the store, like the essence of who they were.
Uncle Herschel.
Yes. The essence of who they were is what people really loved about the brand. But it was also an opportunity that they got that live feedback.
Yeah, they did.
When people were absolutely losing their minds over it.
Yeah.
But it also brought an opportunity for them to say, hey, we want to keep, the customer said, we want to keep Cracker Barrel the way it is. But also, maybe you could enhance the food a bit, right? They were calling out things that were wrong with the brand in multiple ways. So it was not only an opportunity to say, you're doing too much, slow down, the rebrand isn't working, but also here are some opportunities that you can, you can tend to.
And any good CEO is going to look at all of that feedback, because that was free feedback.
Yeah.
Well, it probably wasn't free, but it was immediate.
Yeah.
And they had all that customer feedback within a few hours. So it's not like they had to go do months of market research.
Yeah.
They had it right there on Facebook.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Just every platform, had so much to say about it. But that's great. I think you're able to get that immediate feedback. I think the CEO and their entire executive team took it really well. They honestly made a joke out of it. And they're like, we hear you. Wow. Okay. It was done well. So sometimes in the back of my mind, it makes me think, could it have been a ploy? Maybe an expensive one, but one that works nonetheless. Guess where my family's going for Thanksgiving morning after turkey trot?
What? Well, and that's, we were talking about the fact that, I think we were talking in the lab about this. There is a comfort in a brand like Cracker Barrel that even if you did not grow up in the country, cheese potatoes are going to make you happy, at least for a few minutes. So the comfort that brand represents, I think, is what people didn't want to let go of. It's like Waffle House in Florida.
Yeah.
We know
Wow.
if the Waffle House is open, everything is okay.
Waffle House is one of the funniest brands. We could do a whole episode just on that, but
Yes, we could.
you know, it goes down to some core logic, like what works, what doesn't work. Is the rebrand rooted in a true understanding of your audience? Is it rooted in a forward-thinking mentality, but still holding the roots of your brand and what your entire brand represents?
Is it solving a problem?
Is it
I
solving
had
a
a client
problem?
one time that had, um, I'm not going to say who the client was, but the issue was that as a business, they had participated in a historical event that is vilified by the entire world. And in order to separate themselves from having participated in that event, not promoting the event, they just made a product that was useful in that event. They completely rebranded their company so that they could move away from that history. That is something that, when we were talking about Jaguar a minute ago, that did not work for Jaguar. They should have pulled their history through to an updated brand.
Yeah.
I get the updated brand thing. If you don't evolve, you die. But in a case where your company is seriously associated with something that humanity just can't wrap their mind around, you have to rebrand.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine that this company was the only one ever to have done that. But
I'm sure during wartime there are many who need to shift because of a perception issue. Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, if you make weapons during wartime, you don't want that to be the thing that is the lasting impression for you if you want to be accepted by a wider audience.
And I think when you really break it down to, if you don't know why you're rebranding, don't do it.
Exactly.
Don't do it. Consider doing more market research before taking that action and potentially hurting your entire perception from your audience. Also, watching, it impact your entire financial statement it's rough. So consider it with great detail, especially how it's going to resonate with your audience.
That's one of the things that's interesting about this topic for when we're talking about Henry separating from the church.
Mm-hmm.
The people, there was enough energy whipped up about it that you saw a very old concept in mob mentality take place afterwards. So even though a church might not have been part of the dissolution, there were people that were, breaking the faces off of some of the sculptures, which is a very Roman thing, defamation. And so a lot of artwork, a lot of church artwork was destroyed by people who bought into this idea. So that split between, we want to promote Protestant ideals, or no, we think that we should stay Catholic. That was another social impact of this rebranding of the monarchy. That's really what it was. It was a rebranding of the monarchy.
Absolutely.
That the impact had the same kind of mob mentality we see now, only now we see it at the flash of a keyboard. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take very long to type out 140 words without thinking, 140 characters without thinking. But people were doing that back then too, with destroying artwork and destroying, it's the same thing that happens. It happens here. It still happens here for all the wrong reasons. But it is an instant message about whether or not your brand stuck or not.
Absolutely. And, ultimately, the break from Rome wasn't necessarily about religion.
No.
It wasn't about...
It was about power.
It was about reclamation of power.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so ego-driven, and it's so interesting that the ripple effect from that moment is so significant in English history, in European history, and the entirety of the Western world.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all about Henry VIII and his ego. It's crazy. I could go on for days about him.
Well, he went on to do it again, though. And this, one of the reasons that Cromwell fell on his face was because of the Anne of Cleves issue. There is some debate over whether or not Henry, the popular conception is that Henry didn't find her attractive. There is some debate over whether or not he was ready after his third wife died in childbirth.
Wow. I think it was like within a week he did it.
No, the Anne of Cleves thing was like 3 years later.
Oh, okay.
He got very, very depressed after Jane Seymour died, and didn't. He kind of fell like a souffle for a while, and that is when he said to Cromwell, or maybe Cromwell convinced him, I can't remember, that he needed to marry again if he was going to get another heir. And he had married Jane Seymour, and he apparently loved her very much. She was a model queen wife, gave him a baby boy, and died a week later. And he really got hit hard by that. So when Cromwell starts looking for another wife for him, and he brings him Anne of Cleves, it's, they say, he said she looks like a horse. That's probably not accurate. What is most likely is that he just was not ready. And there was some political maneuvering going on with where she was from. Something had happened. I'd have to reread that article. It was a very detailed article, but there was some conflict in that political arrangement that was suddenly not beneficial anymore. So he didn't really need to marry her to have that conflict resolved. And that was part of the original. There's always debate about every historical thing. We can look back and we can say a certain thing because we have a certain fact, but then you find new documents or you find somebody else's perspective written, because, history is written by the victors. Yeah. You find some other document that makes you rethink how it was presented to the public. But that's part of the brand thing. Mm-hmm. Would Henry have said she's ugly and looks like a horse? Maybe.
He's a guy who executed a couple of his wives. I wouldn't put it past him.
Yeah. But he's also the same guy that was already in his 40s, morbidly obese, had a oozing ulcer on his leg. When he married,
also stunk up a room that you could smell from multiple rooms over.
Exactly.
It's disgusting.
Right. And he marries a 16-year-old coquette who's, did he really expect her to be excited about this arrangement?
I think he did. And he was very not self-aware about
apparently not
his entire appearance too. But yeah, we could have multiple episodes about him.
Yeah. But it goes back to that branding based on his ego. It was all about, and there's some, since I've never been a king, I can't say this from my own perspective, but there is some pressure on a monarchy to produce the next monarch.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the inheritance thing. Now, later, when it wasn't an inheritance issue, you can make other decisions. But when you know that the only way to keep the monarchy going is to have a son, that's going to become your focus no matter what. What I also find interesting about that second part of his life, though, is that when he married Catherine Howard, he already had Prince Edward. Mm-hmm. So,
he didn't necessarily need it, although it didn't work in his favor.
No, it didn't.
Elizabeth I ended up being one of the longest ruling monarchs and one of the most successful.
Yeah, she was hugely successful.
Golden age.
She did not marry, and she didn't have her own kids. So
allegedly,
there's
a debate about that.
That would be
a really conspiracy.
I know, but that would be a really interesting find. That rebranding, that's a whole other episode we could talk about, because she rebranded herself as the Virgin Queen, and that made a huge impact on how people saw her as a monarch. He just couldn't get out of his own way.
Ultimately, I think he was very successful at rebranding in terms of the people went along with it. The people supported it. Of course, there were many that
Not all
did
the people.
not.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's not like they were consumers. They were his people. So
His subjects.
They were his subjects. He could do ultimately whatever he wanted.
Yeah.
And it's a very different concept today. But there are successful rebrands. There are ones that really, really do not hit the mark. And I think it's just the finesse in which they're done. So really, this episode should be more so about Cardinal Wolsey than it is about Henry VIII.
And Cromwell.
And Cromwell.
Yeah.
He was the
he was the figurehead, but it doesn't look like proclamations made by the king are written by other people.
Yes. He
has to agree to them. So I'm sure that his council convinced him all of the things that he was signing were a good idea. And he was a smart guy. I mean, he solidified the use of parliament. Every 3 months, he moved a 3,000 person household, which was essentially a functioning corporation, moved it to a different castle to avoid health risks. Obviously, they were very aware of health risks because they had to keep the princes alive. But it wasn't just moving the household. That was one logistic nightmare. Then you have who's going to stay back and clean up the castle from all the 3,000 people that have been living there? So there was that to manage as well. And then he had to manage, every noble dispute there was. The kingship for him was a very, very complicated thing.
But I think that he will always go down in history as one of the most polarizing, interesting, also semi-disgusting kings that existed. But
he had some real health issues. They also think he had syphilis, which made him a little nuts. So that would explain why he got more and more and more paranoid about not having an heir. And I can't imagine, too, like with Catherine Howard, there is evidence that she did, in fact, have an affair, which is treason.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you trust as a king?
Yeah.
You tell somebody, I want this done, and you give them the power to do it, like you did with Cromwell. You still have to, if you want to keep an eye on how your country's running, you still have to watch that person. He decompensated for 3 years after Jane Seymour died. Didn't really watch much of anything.
Well, Henry, there's much to say about him. But I will say, overall, I think when looking at the rebranding throughout time, throughout the Tudor period and today, there were a lot of successes and there were a lot of failures. But ultimately, we are here now in our current state of the Western world with that influence coming from that time.
Sure.
So ultimately, it was successful.
It's the main church of England, so it was hugely successful. But at the time, don't you wish there was some kind of... You can look through pamphlets, and the printing press had a lot to do with getting messages out faster. But you could print anything on the printing press and distribute it, even if you got in trouble for it later. By the time it gets out, it's just like a viral post. You can delete your own post, but somebody's made a copy of it. And that's how it was with all these ideas, too. You had John Fox, who was, he made pamphlets about the lives of saints and promoting Protestantism. And then there were all these other people that were promoting Protestantism on pamphlets that were distributed. You can look through those things and you can see how they were positioning the idea of this new church with the king as head. But there are also cartoons written against it. So in that period, there is a lot of material that you can peruse just out of sheer curiosity. But it's not any different than it is now. If you can print 1,000 flyers and throw them into a neighborhood, everybody was living really closely, you could get a message out in a few seconds. That hasn't changed.
It has not changed at all.
Now we just do it electronically. And do you think, since you're in marketing and you look at data all the time, because there is such a huge glut now of data, messages are getting buried a lot faster. So there has to be something genuinely controversial about a message, like the brand, like the Cracker Barrel brand thing, for example, that really incites people to passion. So what did we talk about last time? Fear and the two things that make people move. Fear and love. And most of the time for humans, it's fear. You want to make somebody change behavior, you make them afraid.
Yeah, it has to be disruptive.
It has to be disruptive. So if you're talking about something like faith and you tell people, if you practice Catholicism, you're going to go to hell because Catholicism is the devil. And then people on the Catholic side saying the same thing about Protestants, you don't go to confession. It's going to be very bad for you. What makes one idea stick over the other? It's relief. The idea that if I behave well, if I contribute to the church, if I do all of the things I'm supposed to do, I have a place in heaven. And that message drove entire communities to act with things like the witch trials. James I sold the idea, well, James I of England and VI of Scotland, sold the idea that all these wise women, they were midwives, they were doctors, they were, menopausal women who had the knowledge of the community in their heads. Nope, they were witches. And he sold the idea because he wrote a book that caused tremendous fear in people. So the interesting thing about branding something is it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive brand.
Oh, no, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be. I mean, there's a lot of brands that, are companies that people don't necessarily resonate with because they sell to a particular audience or their product is very particular and very polarizing. But at the end of the day, they brand it to their audience. But I think overall, it was a very successful brand in terms of how Henry VIII did it with Cromwell, how the entire history shifted after that period of time. So I think we'll kind of wrap here. And I really appreciate everybody for tuning in and listening to the entire rebrand of England's faith and how Henry VIII played such a crucial role in that. So stay tuned for next time. Thank you.